Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. When this invitation came, it's actually when I saw who'd spoken before. It was a huge honour to be asked, and I haven't delivered a lecture ever. So this is the first lecture. I've had plenty of lectures given to me, but this is the first lecture I've given. Can I also acknowledge the Hopkins family who are here, and as I say, it's a great honour to be asked to give this lecture and something set up by your father and a preeminent engineer. And thank you to the family members who have come to honour that and be part of this. I left engineering school, and I'm trying to remember, but I think it's 1985 I graduated. And there's a period in my CV that looks a bit blank. And just to reassure everybody that I didn't spend a period in jail or anything in that period before my CV properly starts, I left engineering school and pretty much practiced in Christchurch for a couple of years. And then my father had a brain aneurysm. And I went home to look after him, and then he died. And my family then asked me to look after the family farming business, which is effectively what happened. And I got married and took that over. It's a successful business. And so I never really spent a lot of time actually practicing as an engineer. And then people asked me to get involved in local authority work and sort a few issues out, and I became a politician, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's effectively what happened in my life. But I did say when I was talking to Greg earlier that when I left engineering school, I'd done okay, but I wasn't sure it was actually spinning my wheels. I could do all the stuff. So probably in hindsight, I've probably now got onto a field which is more sort of suits me than what I saw at that stage when I left engineering school. So as has been said, I've been the Mayor of Hastings for 15 years, as my opponents are pointing out all the time. It's time for a change. You know, that's going on right at the moment, but that's, I have been the Mayor of Hastings for quite some time. I've been the President of Local Government New Zealand for 8 years. That is a hugely rewarding role for me, and probably gives me the greatest opportunity to talk to what I'm about to talk to tonight. I have chaired the Commonwealth Local Government Forum for 4 years. That is really a collection of the 53 Commonwealth countries supported by Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the UK to support what we take for granted in all the other developing nations in the Commonwealth who haven't got power or haven't got water and all those sort of things. And just last week I was appointed to the New Zealand Infrastructure Unit Advisory Board. There's a 7-person board that advises the Minister of Infrastructure and Minister of Finance on New Zealand's infrastructure needs. So I'm delighted to have been just recently appointed to that. So if I take you through the slides, and I haven't done a lecture before, so just bear with me. I'm going to give you some slides, but I'm actually going to talk to you rather than referring to the slides. You can look at the slides. There are two levels of government in New Zealand, and particularly I can see a lot of students here. So welcome, and at your stage I wouldn't expect to be doing this, you know, but I am doing it, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the things of New Zealand and with some international context. So in New Zealand we only have two forms of government, and I know regional councils will get grumpy at me talking about that because they say they're a different form of government, but there is local government and there is central government. In Australia there are 3 levels, so we actually have quite a simple system, and it's quite unique in that it's clearly defined really what we should do. So Parliament sets the rules. We have no constitutional ability as local government to exist. It's not in the Constitution. They could abandon us tomorrow. There'd be an uproar, but they could. So central government is charged with looking after local interests, and local government is really charged with looking after local and regional interests. And as part of that, we have councillors as elected representatives who are stewards of all the assets that we have to look after in communities that aren't private property, really. And we have to look after those for we've been delivered in the past, what's in the present, and what I'm going to talk about fundamentally in this lecture is about the challenges we face in the future. They're not well understood, but they are nonetheless a challenge. I put this slide in now not because this has got anything to do with New Zealand, but we do need to understand how lucky we are. So these are some countries in the world and the percentage of the population that actually has piped water going to them. So Nigeria, I think, is around 5%. India is about 54%. And then you go right up to some other countries. So in part of my Commonwealth work, I've seen all this. And I come back to New Zealand and I hear conversations about infrastructure and who's got what. And I've just put that in for no other reason than for everybody to realise we are incredibly lucky in New Zealand with the quality of the infrastructure, the standard of living and the services we all enjoy, and in many cases most people take for granted. So that's all I'm going to say really about the international context. It's there, and I'm happy to share that later on. As I started this, I wanted to talk really from an engineer's perspective as well, which is one of the reasons why I've been asked. Engineers, in my view, are tremendously well trusted. They generally want to do the right thing. I can't say that about every profession, and I'm not about to name them, but I can't say that about every profession. In my experience, when an engineer comes and talks to me in whatever forum I'm in at a governance level, they've done the work, they're trying to find a solution for the right reasons, at an optimal cost. That's generally the starting point. And a lot of this stuff is so technical that governors have no choice but to trust you as engineers. And sure, we might get peer reviews and a whole lot of other things, but it's a high trust environment. And as engineers, you should be proud of that, because I won't name the other professions, but it's not always the case. So in my view, you're always trying to do the right thing, and that should be applauded. But in how we deal with community infrastructure going forward, decision making actually really matters. And it's actually the task, whether you're in central or local government, but I'm specifically going to talk about local government, it is the most important task. You are charged as an elected official to make decisions about all sorts of things. That's your principal role. You can be on Facebook and you can be popular and you can do all those things, but actually as a governor, your principal role is to make decisions on behalf of your community, to advance your community, to look after them, and to make their lives as good as you possibly can. And almost everything a local authority does requires a decision. Whether it's investing in a massive project like a wastewater plant, right down what sort of matting do you put under a playground. And you might find this strange, but in my experience, the smaller the decision, the longer it takes to make it. Who goes to a conference can be debated for half an hour. Spending $5 million on some water plant will be through in 5 minutes. That's just how it is. It's never been any different, and it probably never will be. The Local Government Act, which is a prescriptive piece of legislation that we have to operate under, really spells out how the decisions are made. You either decide on following a particular course of action or basically decide not to. This next slide, I'm not sure how well it comes up. I would argue that this is the most fundamental thing that local government governors need to do. Because the strength in the decisions actually has long-term implications, both in terms of risk, but also in terms of opportunities, and in many of the big issues I'm going to talk about later, like climate change, demographic change, about the long-term success of communities. And this, I think, these words really encapsulate the fundamental thing of what we do. And there are some challenges around this, and I'll talk about those in a minute. For anybody that's ever been in governance and management, there is always a tension and often a balance. What most people don't realise is the second to bottom line. The local authority only employs one person. That's the chief executive. There is no employment relationship in law between the elected local authority and all the other staff. The chief executive, in law, has a relationship between him or herself and all the other staff. There is very few pieces of legislation which are as blunt and direct as that. But previous governments has saw fit to split that out. They also saw fit to say that you cannot have a chief executive in a position for more than 5 years without publicly advertising the position. I would argue that some of that's about disdain between central and local government over time, but nonetheless it's in the law. And if you look at what I would argue is the left and the right, I want to give some pretty candid views about some of those. So in a governance space, like I'm seeing at the University Student Association, there's an election. People put signs up, flyers up, they get voted in. Do those people have all the right skills to be a governor of multi-million dollar businesses? Do they have all the right attitudes? Have they got secret agendas or public agendas? Do they have the appropriate knowledge to actually be a steward or understand these things? And the answer to all those things is no, they don't. It is a group of people from the community that have been elected by the community with a mixture of skills, put in charge of running and governing their community and multi-million dollar decisions. So clearly there's some risk around that. You also, if you move down the governance side and look at the effective bit, doing the right things, and I'm going to be direct here, there's a classic case playing out in Whanganui at the moment about their wastewater plant. The engineers said it should be a plant built like this. The politicians, principally led by the mayor, said that's too expensive, you've only got X. The plant doesn't work. Sewage is flowing into the river, into the sea, and they're going to have to rebuild a new plant at pretty much double what the original plant cost. Now I give that as an example, not that I've got all the direct detail, but that's generally the terms of it, because what governors have to do is the right thing, not just the thing that might be politically expedient on the day or may have got them into power or will keep them in power. And sometimes I think governors fall down in that space. And at a management side, directly across the other side of that, governors expect consultants, engineers, staff to do things right. And in the middle, there is a grey area. And sometimes in this grey area, things get AWOL. And I give an example. Kaipara is well known to many people. Pretty major mistakes were made. Governance, management, audit. I use those as extreme examples because they are two, the Whanganui and the Kaipara ones, which are examples. But they probably only represent less than 1% of the total spend in infrastructure that's done at any one time. And the majority of it is absolutely fine. Well thought out, delivered on time, technically safe, all those things. But the point is that those two examples I've given tend to frame what happens around us in a legislative environment, what the government wants to do to us, etc., etc. And then if you look further down, you will see, strategy and policy leadership, or up at the top, long-term strategic views. If somebody's gone on to a local authority because they want to protect a local park and they're passionate about it and they've got the numbers, what skills do they have to deal with some of those much, much bigger things that we're faced with? Performance monitoring is the same. So I'm going to talk a little bit later. That is a critical weakness, particularly in governance in New Zealand. It's part of the Westminster system. You allow for democracy, but you don't always get the mix of skills that you need or the willingness to accept what skills you do need to enhance them. Now, section 14 is what's laid down in decision-making principles, and I'll say this at the beginning. These are principles laid down in legislation that we have to follow, but the government actually often doesn't follow itself. I'll just give you that as a little irony. So we are controlled by legislation and we operate in these ways. So when we're doing what we do, we need to be open and transparent and democratically accountable. We need to give effect to the priorities and outcomes in an efficient and effective way. And we have regard to the views of its communities. Now, which community is that? Because our communities are made up of independent little communities and they all have views. And I'll give you just a little example of my own in Hastings at the moment. We've decided, like a lot of CBDs in New Zealand who are struggling from retail changes, that actually would be quite a good thing to take out parking meters and make parking free in the Hastings CBD. So we can do that, and it'll cost you $25 on your rates every year. So you don't have to pay for any money, but you pay for it in your rates. So all the retailers say this is fantastic. The people on the street say this is fantastic. This week they say this is fantastic. So we put out a form. We got 1,000, I think. They went to every household. Form came back. 75% of the people that came back with a form said, we don't want to pay in our rates. We want to leave the meters there. So I say, oh, okay. So when we have a panel, we had 400 people panel that we put to anything contentious, what do you think? 65% of them came back and said, we don't want to pay in our rates. So what are we meant to do as a local authority when we've got one part of the community saying, this is what you need to do, and the shoppers saying this is fantastic, but the people who have to pay don't? And I just give you that as an example to say, when you take regard of what communities say, there are often very differing views from one part of the community and another. And you do need to take part of that diversity, and you absolutely need to think about the future interests of your community. That's not always easy. Those are challenging decisions. And particularly since the treaty settlements are going on and the legislation was changed in 2012, we have to provide significant opportunities for Māori to contribute. And I'd say that's far more embedded in the norm now than it used to be. Equally, we need to seek, and this is written in law, to collaborate and cooperate with other local authorities. Well, you look in New Zealand and you'll say that actually the chances and success of that is actually quite small, because 78 independent local authorities with 78 mayors or chairs and councillors and chief executives, there's actually not a major motivation to collaborate unless you can save some money. And even that hasn't proven to be a major driver. You need to exercise sound business practices, and you need to be prudent in the way you steward and look after the use of those resources. And that's including the future management of your assets. And then it lays down in more prescriptive styles, take a sustainable development approach, which means taking into account the social, economic and cultural interests of people and communities, the need to maintain and enhance the quality of the environment. So the environment in local government sense has become a bigger and bigger issue, and it will continue to be so. So policies around water quality will drive a whole lot of decisions. I would argue that the population generally wants a standard out here of water quality that's very good and aspirational, but they haven't lined up the cost yet of getting all the infrastructure to that level that will provide. So it's a bit of a Clayton's argument at the moment, and I don't think in New Zealand yet we've had those proper discussions. And you need to provide for the reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations. Now, the elephant in the room actually is around how you manage to do all this, particularly in the infrastructure space, with all the other things that are going on in society. And there's people here that know a lot about asset management. I would argue that New Zealand local government asset management is way better than Australia's, and I'd also argue it's way better than central government's. And we are actually at the leading edge of doing it, despite the fact that I don't sometimes think we get the recognition for that. So once again, we have another law. It says we must meet the current and future needs of communities for good quality local infrastructure in the way that is most cost effective for households and businesses. That is a law change that was made in 2012 by the government to try and tell us that we need to be more efficient and effective and constrain what we do. No consultation really, they just did it. They also said, and I'll talk about this in a minute, that we need a 30-year infrastructure strategy. You going to ask the government whether they've got a 30-year infrastructure strategy? No. And we also have to have particular regard for network infrastructure, public transport, solid waste collection and disposal, how we manage natural hazards, and it's a much greater part of our work than it used to be post the Canterbury earthquakes. And then we've got other provisions around libraries, museums, reserves, recreational facilities, etc. Now, if you look at the total infrastructure in New Zealand, you will see that central government has around $200 billion worth. Schools, prisons, hospitals, state highways, electricity generation. Local government has about $135 billion worth. And they're in the waters, local roads, libraries, recreational facilities, cemeteries, flood protection, ports and airports, landfills. And nobody can actually give us the data on the private sector, but it'll be a substantial amount. The point I raise in that is that when the New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy first came out, the document about this thick, about all the infrastructure in New Zealand, local government infrastructure had one line in it. Yet we have $135 billion worth of assets. In the second iteration, we have a paragraph, and then the most recent one, there is chapters, and we're involved in just about everything. The point of me saying that is I want people to understand that actually what your local communities do and local government does is actually of significant value and has significant amount of cost associated with it. Typically, also, this is where we spend our money. Roading, obviously, takes up the bulk of the largest expenditure at 17%, transport at 12%, wastewater 9%, water is about 5%. That's really where the money gets spent. So the big money is actually majority spent on infrastructure. And, you know, we can argue about governance and a whole lot of other things. And council support services, I was meant to find out what that was because it's higher than, I think there's some big stuff in there, but I think it's just the wording of it. Now, I'm not sure how easy you can see that. In 2012, the government said you need to change the way you look at infrastructure because we had what we call the 11-year problem. So under the Local Government Act, you have to put out a budget for 10 years. And if you're an elected person, it's very easy to shove everything into year 11, which is outside the budget, makes you look popular and you don't need to fund it. So there was a year 11 issue. So what you've got here is really the first time the 30-year infrastructure strategies were put in, and you'll see that from where we were in 2016 is just about 120 million of replacement capital per annum, has jumped to about 170 at the first time we've looked past that 10-year period, and then it goes up. So clearly the government had identified that there was what I would call underreporting and movement of infrastructure costs past the transparency regime of the 10-year budgets. So there it is. There's clearly an issue, potentially, of significant infrastructure spends looking out into the future. 2036-45, there is a massive period of replacement of infrastructure required in that period. So, once again, we're a little bit critical at the time, but the government clearly said we have to show this. There it is, and communities will have to adapt and learn how to manage that. What drives infrastructure management? And this slide is a bit busy, but I want to talk about the left-hand side. Customer expectations. in my experience, people want more and more and don't want to pay much more for it. So they constantly want better levels of service. They constantly want us to be more efficient. And by the way, if you can keep that at the rate of inflation or keep the rates at close to zero, that'd be a really good thing to do. But if you go back to the last slide where I showed that infrastructure spend, there's no way that that can be funded when you're keeping rates close to zero or the rate of inflation. Yet those communities at some point are going to have to deal with that. And when I was first elected, well, actually just before I was elected mayor, but I was on the council, we got a chief executive from the private sector came into Hastings, and we were having water pipes leaking up. It was like a Christmas tree. You'd show a map of Hastings with every water leak, and it'd go up like a Christmas tree. And he said, this can't be right. How do we fix this? They said, all the pipe networks are old, they need to be replaced. We put the rates up by 6% for 3 years, every year for 3 years, with the community, and said, we need to do this. You put the Christmas tree up now, there's no lights on it. Well, there might be the odd one. But the community said, we understand this needs to be fixed. So cost is a level of service, and cost is a big driver, and they're not always linked intrinsically in people's views. So we want asphaltic concrete, roads because it's quieter. But hang on, it costs 3 times as much to what noisy bitumen does. We don't care. Oh, okay, so you want us now to put the rates up by 10% and put asphaltic concrete? Oh, no, we're not saying that. So those are the types of balances we have. And then also we have legislative requirements. So the government in 2012 brought in benchmarks and caps. Debt cannot go above certain levels. We have to have all these strategies. So it's quite an interesting world we live in. And then those 3 in the middle, long-term planning, level of service review, and infrastructure management, tend to go round and round in iterations. And the fundamental thing that still drives them is how much money is available to do all this stuff, and how much will the ratepayer tolerate to fund it all. That is still a fundamental driver. On top of that boring basic stuff, there are new things we have to deal with. Natural hazards and extreme weather events. And I presume most of you believe in sea level rise. I do. I'm not sure whether we've caused it all, but it's happening. And so as you look at that, that is a new level of complexity in your planning. It's not just about what the ratepayers can afford or what should be where. It's actually happening, and you're going to have to fundamentally adapt. There is also new phenomena going on economically. There is regional inequality. So if you're in Auckland and your house price has gone from $500,000 to $1 million, if you own a couple of those houses, that's probably a fantastic thing. But if you're trying to buy one, that's really difficult. But if you live in Oamaru or Wairoa, you haven't had that same capital gain opportunity or the opportunities for jobs, etc. Equally, as I've pointed out, there can be some quite high financial risks of failure. If you get things wrong, they cost communities a lot of money, and there's very little, 1, tolerance, or B, capacity to absorb those losses. There is also, if I go down to the next one, which is around policy changes, there is a growing increase of standards required at every level you look at. Whether that is around air quality, water quality, financial accountability, the standards we have to comply with are going up and up and up. Our communities expect them, but they do come at a cost. And the last one is that at the same time all that's going on, voter turnout continues to drop. 42% at the last local government elections. It's an international phenomenon, and most of you that are young in this room and are students might say, well, do you participate? Do you want to participate? Are you on the roll? Don't you care? All that stuff. But the people that are participating, the numbers are dropping. That makes democracy challenging. Because the old adage, if you don't vote, you don't have a say, when 60% of your community hasn't even voted, they still want to have a say. Now, I'll just give some quick examples on coastal hazard stuff. Now, I've got Dunedin and Christchurch on there, and they're the low-lying areas that are less than half a metre above sea level. In New Zealand, at the last census, there are 46,000 residents that are in the zone across New Zealand. There are 9,000 properties, 9,000 residential properties, 13,000 other types of properties, and a replacement cost of those are about $3 billion. And then councils who own jetties and wharf, there are about 1,500 pieces of infrastructure that are less than half a metre above sea level. Now, we all know that sea level in the next 100 years is going to rise by somewhere between 500 mils and a metre. Somewhere, it's debatable. But those people are in stook. Unless you either defend yourselves, you pump yourself out of it, or you move. And as we seek to redress those, the costs associated with that are massive. Then we have earthquakes. So in our communities, post-Christchurch, and you'll all be familiar with it, you know, there are costs of earthquake strengthenings, regimes, compliance issues, both at local government and business levels, that are massive costs on our communities. So the government has mapped New Zealand. High risk, medium risk, low risk. On the left-hand side really is, this is what the territorial authorities have to do about it. In the high risk, they have to identify the earthquake-prone buildings, somewhere between 2.5 and 5 years. And on the right-hand side, this is what the landowner's got to do. So if you're in a high risk, you've got 7.5 years to fix it, and a priority building. If you're not a priority building, you've got 15 years. If you're in a medium risk, you've got 25 years. And if you're not at risk at all, you've got 35 years. And the theory being that actually you're probably going to have to replace significant parts of that building in that time, and you're no risk. So if you can see, you've got Auckland North, that's low risk, and the east coast of the South Island. But there are massive parts of New Zealand that are high risk from seismic and earthquake risks. So that's a new factor that's come in, not only for local authorities, but for communities to plan, fund and adapt to. So this really comes from another report, but the bit in the middle is influenced by all those things around it. We've never really thought like this before. And I'm sure at engineering school, and there's a lot of thinking going on here, but actually for communities to try and work that out is a substantial new issue that wasn't there 6 years ago. But it is there now. Liquefaction. Who'd heard of liquefaction before the Canterbury earthquakes? Yeah, I'm sure some people had. And I had just. But now, all around New Zealand, this is going on. Areas I've identified as high, medium and low risk. Now, I presume these are right, these have been given to me, but, you know, I've got the same in Hawke's Bay. There's maps for galore where it's high, medium and low. And you've got to say, well, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to prevent building in high areas? Are you going to shift people? And it's not just earthquakes. There's Canterbury, there's flooding. Once again, from where I come from, we've got all these maps. But you put that together, and you put those three together, flooding, liquefaction, sea level rise, you fundamentally change the right decisions about what should be put where and where you need to be in 100 years. But if you talk to somebody now, they say, no, we'll be right, this won't happen, it'll be fine, we're not paying, just leave us alone. So as a governor, how are you meant to adjust, modify your policies, even shift people or protect them from those risks when they happen over time? In earthquakes, nothing might happen for the next 100 years. One of those floods might happen in 2 weeks' time. How do you help and make your community make those decisions? And that's incredibly difficult. And I would argue this stuff is harder for us to do than a lot of the policy setting that's made by central government, because people are involved. It's their houses, their lives, they're living and breathing it. couple of other things. The population is ageing. Now, New Zealand is about similar to international standards, but it is ageing. People are getting older, less young people. It has got a greater diversity in it. Look at the immigration stats. You go to Auckland, even here probably. Look at the changes in the makeup of society. There is big issues about social cohesion, and that's being brought out with homeless people and people being able to, whether they're going to rent for their whole life, ever buy a home, those type of things. And at the end of the day, at local government, we're still being asked to do more and more with the same amount of money than we've always had, and that's a challenge. This map here pretty much maps the population. If it's a hatched area, it means between now and 2031 you're going to lose people. Your population is going to decline. So you can see the East Coast, Wairoa, East Cape, Ruapehu, right out to the South Taranaki, the West Coast, probably Northern Otago. They're losing people. And then if you look at the colouring, that means that you're going to get a lot of older people in those areas. So there's Tauranga, the Kapiti Coast, and further south into sort of Otago as well. If you've got an older population and the population's declining, you actually got a double whammy as to how you fund everything you need for a community. So I've said this before, but these barriers exist. The government put in debt constraints. You cannot have debt over a certain level. You're not allowed to. That came in 2012. There is more and more NIMBY concern than there used to be. In other words, not in my backyard. We want this to happen, but just leave me alone. It doesn't affect me. Do it to them. There is a greater risk of challenge legally, so more and more people object to decisions, particularly retired lawyers and things. In the Kapiti Coast we saw this. They wanted to put lines on the maps about sea level rise and erosion. They had to walk away from the end. Lawyers involved, they take people to court. We're far more litigious in this space than we ever used to be. The next one is unambiguous legislation. That really refers to the leaky home scenario. That's where that came from. So who's liable when this goes wrong? And in that case, local authorities will often ping, in my view, unfairly for their level of responsibility for that failure. So understanding all of those things means that we have to increasingly look at decision making and the risks in those calculations. How do you get a single political vision and buy-in? We operate on a 3-year electoral cycle. People get bought in because they're popular or they stand for something. But we're actually trying to deal with issues that span 10, 20, 30, 50 or 100 years. It is incredibly challenging based on the way our system's set up. We have strategic plans, but they can be tipped on their head really quickly and really easily. And do we have mayors to lead effectively? So I know a lot of this stuff because I've been doing it for a long time. I've sat in ministers' offices for years talking about this stuff. But you get elected on the basis that I'm going to campaign to keep the rates down, and I've come from the business sector, say. How do you factor all these things I'm talking about into the long-term strategic thinking for New Zealand? There is also, and it's more recent, but I think it's wavered a bit, there's this cold tension between what is the critical size of a local authority, whether there should be further amalgamations, what is critical scale, what is local versus national, what is local versus regional, what is the best size. I also think we need to also understand better the quality of the advice we get. As I've said to you, and I think I'm not being generous, I'm being realistic. Engineers' advice is generally good advice. But we don't always get advice from engineers, we get it from other sorts of people as well. And it can be very variable. So one of the things is to recognise what we do and don't know. Because unless you can ask the right questions, you can be completely led down the garden path. So how do we effectively decide the best configuration for delivering those services? How can we make sure we're most efficient and effective as we can be? And some of that revolves around changing our thinking. So there's a big debate going on at the moment around not what the local authority does, but how your services are provisioned. So does it make sense in this area for all the roading to be done by one roading company? Might go right down to Ashburton, Timaru, one contract, one company, and if that saved you $50 million a year, and I'm just giving an example, is that worth doing? Would the waters be better managed by a CCO or something else? It's not amalgamation, it's simply saying about the service delivery. The problem with that theory is so much of the service delivery and the waters and roading makes up a huge amount of what a council does. And if you put that out and somewhere out here, like an Auckland model, some of those councils have very little left to do. And that questions their whole viability. So, I showed you pictures before about where the population's declining or where it's ageing. For some of those communities, they are not going to be fiscally sustainable into the future. They will not have enough people, the infrastructure costs will be too high, and they will not be able to make it work. The rates will just go up, so people just can't afford it. So one of the conversations we're having with the government is if that needs extra help somehow, because we're part of New Zealand and some of those communities need to be supported, how can that be done? The government said, we're happy to look at that in future years, but we want to make sure what you're doing now has been done as efficiently as it can be. So all the things underneath that, which are multifunctional council, amalgamations, there's a model in the UK where 2 councils, sometimes 3, they have one management unit, one chief executive, they deliver all the services for 3 councils. One council meets here and they said, Mr. Chief Executive, this is what we want. They get the same, another council gets the same chief executive and said, our community wants this. There are lots of different models, and if I'm honest, our sector's been quite slow at adopting them. The new legislation out at the moment looks at jointly owned CCOs, that's council-controlled organisations, across a number of local authorities. So you could put all the roads in Canterbury if you wanted to, and that'd be owned by a CCO of Christchurch City, Waimakariri, Selwyn, and if you want to go down to Ashburton and Timaru, you could, if you wanted to. That's not currently allowed, but it will be under this new legislation. And then ultimately, there is conversations about privatisation, most likely in the water space. There are people who talk about water and the Scottish water model and all the rest of it. Now that's a holy grail of local government. You don't want to start talking about that easily or you're soon voted out of office. But there are other models around the world where they do things differently. So I'm just conscious of time. The local government New Zealand has done some major work on the 3 waters to look at what is the state of water, wastewater and stormwater. It's fair to say it's in not bad shape, but there is massive ongoing investment required 20 years out. Have we got the resources to do that? No, under the current funding models. We're looking at how we manage risk based on the Canterbury experience, because most people may not know this. Anything that happens under the ground, in a natural disaster, the government picks up 60% and a local authority picks up 40%. And the Canterbury earthquake example, that cost of the government was way more than they ever thought possible, so they're reviewing that whole relationship. And I think it'll mean that local authorities and you, the ratepayers, will end up picking a greater share of those costs than currently exist. We've done a major piece of work on natural hazards. So when you look at those 3 hazards, whether it's flooding, liquefaction, sea level rise, we actually have to fundamentally change our thinking. Even though that's difficult, because no good come rocking up in 100 years and say, actually, we've known about this for 99, but we've got to do something about it now. You've actually got to incrementally work your way through that, even though that's difficult. Now, the bottom one is really about what we're trying to do at Local Government New Zealand, which is to train our people to better understand this stuff because running a city or a district is not only about being popular, and it's not only about talking to ratepayers about why the pothole hasn't been fixed. The big opportunities for leadership are actually in these much bigger spaces. And last year we did a major piece of work looking at the reputation of local government, and frankly it was terrible. 29 out of 100 was our ranking. So that's what people thought about how we operate. So we've tipped that on its head, and councils are going through a major what we call excellence program where they're going to be rated by independent people, and that'll be publicly available. We're going to say actually they're going to learn from that, and they're going to learn from their peers. And in 3 years' time, I expect everybody will be in that system. So, in closing, can I say these things? Decision makers, like what I do, and in my role, need a far, far longer perspective, which is counterintuitive to the 3-year electoral cycle. But I'd say this, local government, because it's connected to communities, tends to be less political and works over time to address these issues with its communities. And it's in a better place to do that than central government. And we must focus on the future. And as part of that, we must lead the local debate about the importance of infrastructure, even though it costs money. So in summaries, engineering solutions are always possible. I've found very few things that an engineer can't solve. In fact, I haven't found any. But they come at a cost, and they still have to be the right thing to do. And the right thing is the right thing in terms of cost, technical application, and affordability and timeframes of the solution. If you look back 50 years' time, that's when you need to look at, was that the right thing to do? So if you develop something now, if somebody's going to look back in 50 years' time and say that was really well done, that was really well thought after, that was visionary, I sometimes think we don't apply enough of that test. And for a ratepayer's perspective, one of the challenges is balancing the cost versus value argument. We have ended up in a world, in New Zealand particularly, where ratepayers expect the rates to be at the rate of inflation or less. And when you look at the challenges we face, whether they're the long-term infrastructure spend, whether natural hazards we face, that will simply not be possible to support the infrastructure requirements of New Zealand, particularly in local government. So there's a community journey to have on that. And for the younger of you in the audience who are presumably students, my job has been made harder in one sense and easier in another. Harder in that social media has allowed everybody to say everything about anything in a completely uncontrolled way and give me messages. That's somebody of my generation. But in a positive way, it allows conversations to be had about these types of issues in a sense that can be very constructive. Because you will be the ones that are both providing technical solutions. You will be the ones, particularly those of you that are students, that are going to fund this stuff. I'll be rocking around in my Zimmer frame hoping that I've still got the pension. But you guys will actually be the people that have got to make these decisions. Politicians will often challenge the cost, and speaking to a group of engineers, expect that. But don't change the way in which I think you've always operated by wanting to promote the right thing. Because that's what's needed. It's the integrity of the information you're giving and your profession. And lastly, can I say this? In the context of natural risks, demographic changes, a view from communities about value, a challenge around funding, in my view, a lack of a national strategy, we need to make sure that whatever we do, we look at things in a holistic and long-term way. Every decision we make is integrated in something else and will have implications. And I give you this example as a way of looking at that. And it's a bit controversial around here, but when a decision was made to consider moving Invermay out to Lincoln, it was a science-based decision, largely to say, actually, we put all the scientists together out at Lincoln, that'd be a fantastic thing to do. And for that entity, that might be the right solution. But what it potentially did, or does, to Dunedin and the science community in Otago and Southland was not really measured in that conversation. And as a country, we are 4 million people and we're small. We need to understand that one decision has an impact on somewhere else. And if you look at the generations and the net sum gain of that, you can't think that a science budget here says this, but we don't need to worry about that. Because ultimately, those costs get picked up by somebody else. Another part of government, a local authority, residents who lose property value. So in closing, can I say, thank you for the opportunity to talk. I have a view that as New Zealand, we don't think holistically enough and we don't think long-term enough. And it is very politically expedient to make decisions on a 3-year electoral cycle or to push bad news out to 11 years in a 10-year budget. But it actually will come back to bite us, and it's not the right thing for New Zealand. Thank you very much.